here's John Lennon's kid. And so to even begin to try and make real friends at that stage was a tough thing to do.
He was born into melody and into chaos. The son of a Beatle, but a child of silence. For Julian Lennon, legacy was never gentle. It came wrapped in applause for someone else's name. He grew up in the eye of a storm he never chose. Fame wasn't just around him, it divided his home. The cameras saw love, behind them, fracture. In later years, Julian spoke with calm precision, like someone still untangling a lifetime of echoes. And when he said the words, "I totally hated her," it wasn't rage, it was release. He wasn't attacking a person, he was confronting a ghost made of grief, misunderstanding, and the long shadow of a father who became myth before he became memory. This is not a story about scandal, it's about inheritance, the emotional kind. A son searching for peace in the wreckage of legend. Here is the story behind Julian Lennon's confession. How love, resentment, and legacy shaped one of rock's most complicated airs, the inheritance of noise. Julian Lennon's life began in the loudest decade imaginable. Born into Beatlemania, he never had a quiet room. His father's voice filled the world, but rarely their home. For Julian, music wasn't freedom, it was competition. Every radio hit carried his father's shadow, every cheer reminded him of what was missing. For most children, fame is distant. For Julian, it was domestic. His father's face wasn't just on the radio, it was everywhere, on posters, in papers, in songs about other people. Inside that noise, a small boy learned the difference between presence and attention. The world loved John Lennon, but Julian needed a father. He grew up watching a legend he barely knew become everyone's symbol of peace. Behind the curtain, he lived in the quiet after the applause, the hum of an empty house, the sound of his mother moving through silence while the world worshipped a myth. I admired him deeply, but he wasn't there when I needed him most. Cynthia kept him grounded, holding normal life together while chaos circled the door. Yet every song John wrote for someone else felt like another message left unsent. Years later, he reflected not with anger but perspective. Distance, he said, became his teacher. A biographer once wrote that Julian grew up in the shadow of a man who had already left the room. That shadow became his compass. It taught him that fame was fragile, that applause could drown intimacy. When he finally picked up a guitar, it wasn't rebellion, it was survival. And in the end, he didn't inherit the sound, he inherited the silence behind it. Cynthia, the mother and the mirror. Cynthia Lennon raised her son alone, while the world adored a man already gone to myth. She carried the grace, the discipline, and the silence. But to Julian, that restraint felt cold, like emotional exile. Years later he admitted, "I totally hated her. Not from cruelty, but from years of feeling unseen." She had been through storms, before. From art school beginnings to sudden fame, Cynthia had lived beside a man who was never meant to be ordinary. When John left, she chose dignity over drama. But dignity has a cost, and for a boy growing up in the aftermath, that calm could feel like distance. "I totally hated her," he said, "because I didn't understand her." To the public, she was the forgotten Beatle wife. To Julian, she was the parent who stayed, but never seemed to stay close enough. Resentment became the only language he knew how to speak as a teenager.
I don't know, it sort of built up it was more like a wise uncle, you know.
Time softened that anger. As Julian entered adulthood, he began to see the quiet survival behind his mother's restraint. Cynthia hadn't been cold, she had been cautious. She was protecting him from the same noise that once shattered their home. He later said her love was like air, everywhere, but invisible. Their bond lived in small gestures, phone calls, letters, shared silence. When Cynthia passed away, Julian's tribute was tender. He called her his greatest teacher, proof that understanding can arrive long after love begins. In the end, she became the mirror he had avoided looking into, reflecting not just his pain, but his strength. The woman who replaced her. When Yoko Ono entered John's world, everything changed. Julian's childhood fractured overnight. His mother's heartbreak became a household language, and Yoko became the symbol of everything taken. Decades later, Julian softened. But in youth, the bitterness ran deep. He wasn't just losing a parent. He was losing the version of love he'd believed in. To the public, Yoko was the mysterious muse who transformed John. To Julian, she was the quiet wall that separated him from his father. The love story the world adored had begun at the expense of his own childhood. He once described that period as watching life move on without you. The words carried the weight of exile. In interviews years later, Julian admitted that resentment became habit. He blamed Yoko for the distance, even for the silence. "I had built up so much anger toward her," he said, "because I couldn't direct it anywhere else." But time and perspective would change everything. After John's death, grief forced both of them to confront what was left unsaid. For years they exchanged tense letters, then eventually quiet understanding. Julian later said, "We spoke, we cried, and something lifted. She became part of my family, whether I wanted it or not." He would go on to attend Yoko's exhibitions, even lending his support to projects honoring his father's memory. It wasn't reconciliation for the cameras, it was peace for the soul. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, it gave it meaning. What began as division ended as endurance, a reminder that even broken families can find harmony, note by note, letters, silence, and the weight of absence. After the Beatles dissolved, the distance didn't. Julian's connection with his father was measured in postcards and headlines. There were moments of hope, short visits, shared laughter, but they never lasted. When John was gone, the grief was layered with confusion, love unfinished, conversations unspoken, forgiveness left waiting in the margins of letters.
But I'm not the only one.
Julian once said he only ever received glimpses of his father, a few phone calls, a handful of meetings, then years of silence. "He was there and gone again, like a tide that never stayed," he recalled. For most of the world, John Lennon was immortal, a visionary, an icon of peace. But to Julian, he was a stranger whose shadow kept shifting. The rare moments together, playing music, sharing jokes, felt borrowed, as if they belonged to someone else's life. He often said it was harder to mourn someone who had already been gone long before they died. After John's death, Julian discovered boxes of old letters and sketches addressed to him, but never sent. In the margins and half-finished lines, he found traces of the man he had wanted to know. "It was all there," he said, "but it was too late to answer." Those fragments became both wound and comfort. They proved that love existed, even when time didn't allow it to grow. The music Julian made after that, melancholic, searching, wasn't about fame. It was about closure and the fragile beauty of unfinished love. Every melody became a conversation he never had, each lyric a bridge between two lives separated by silence. The reckoning through music. Julian didn't fight the legacy, he reinterpreted it. Songs like "Too Late for Goodbyes" and "Saltwater" carried the ache of inheritance. Where his father sang revolution, Julian sang reflection. Each lyric was both bridge and wound, a son reclaiming the language that once excluded him. In music, he found what family never gave: understanding. He grew up under the echo of a myth, yet his voice never tried to compete with it. Instead, Julian wrote from the quiet corners of emotion about love, loss, and survival. Critics noticed something familiar in his phrasing, the Lennon timbre that history wouldn't let him escape. But there was no imitation, only interpretation, a translation of legacy into something deeply personal. "I had to stop trying to be my father," he once said. "I had to write from where it hurt." The songs became his reconciliation. Velotte carried nostalgia without sentimentality. Saltwater mourned the planet, and, in a way, his father too. His work didn't aim for revolution, it sought resolution. Each album was a slow exhale, a balancing act between pain and peace, proof that melody could hold both memory and mercy. He was often asked if his music was therapy. Julian resisted that idea. "It's not therapy," he said, "it's truth in a melody." That truth became his voice, measured, mature, and deeply human. While John sang of imagining a better world, Julian sang of surviving the one left behind. And through that honesty, he became his own artist. Not an echo, but an answer. A songwriter who turned inheritance into art, memory into meaning, and pain into permanence. The long forgiveness. As years passed, hate faded into perspective. Julian began speaking of his mother with gratitude, not distance. He reconciled with Yoko too in quiet gestures, proof that peace sometimes whispers. What began as resentment ended as release. Because love, when it survives history, doesn't shout. It forgives, and finally, it rests. Time softened the edges that once defined his pain. The bitterness that colored his youth dissolved into understanding. He no longer chased approval from ghosts. He built his own calm. "Forgiveness," he once said, "isn't about the past. It's about letting yourself move forward."
For the world I love is dying, and now I'm crying.
His relationship with Yoko turned from silence to mutual respect. They exchanged letters, supported the same causes, and shared memories of John without rivalry. Julian even attended events celebrating his father's legacy, something once unimaginable. "Time heals what pride protects," he told an interviewer years later. Through loss, he rediscovered grace. His connection to his mother deepened too. He described her not as a victim of history, but as a survivor of it. In his music she lived on, not in lyrics, but in tone, in patience, in the warmth between lines.
I know religion too.
Forgiveness didn't erase the past, it reframed it. It turned pain into perspective, and memory into meaning. In that calm, he no longer carried his father's burden, he carried his own truth, defined by empathy, endurance, and peace. And in that quiet, he finally found what he had searched for all along: peace without conditions, and love without ghosts. Julian Lennon's story isn't about fame, inheritance, or rebellion. It's about the quiet work of becoming whole after being born into fragments. He took the noise of a generation and turned it into something fragile and human, a melody shaped by loss, softened by forgiveness. Through decades of misunderstanding and absence, he never sought revenge against legacy. Instead, he rewrote it. His journey reminds us that healing doesn't arrive as applause or closure. It arrives in stillness, in the slow surrender of resentment. He learned that family isn't fixed by fame, and love isn't measured by presence, it's measured by what we choose to carry forward. Julian Lennon may have grown up in the shadow of the world's most famous father, but in time, he found his own light. And perhaps that's what forgiveness truly sounds like: something quiet, steady, and finally free. If you felt this story, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories from the heart of music and memory.